All right, thank you all participants for the annual conference at the National Chongqing University in Taiwan. This is the 2022 annual conference of the Rural Economic Society of Taiwan. We have more than 120 participants registered online. And I'm sorry for not seeing them all here on site because of the weather and because of some of them are still on the way here because of traffic. So we are very, very grateful to have the opportunity to start the conference with our keynote, Dr. Professor Bruce McCarl from Texas A&M University. Before then, we have our opening remark from our Vice President of the University. So please, let's welcome our distinguished Professor Fu Zhan. Please join us. Welcome.
抱歉，因为我不晓得是国际研讨会，所以我用讲中文。卢理事长，还有我们与会的贵宾，大家好，大家早。非常高兴应邀来参加2022台湾农村经济协会的会员大会跟研讨会。那我仅代表中兴大学致上诚挚的感谢各位今天能够来莅临今天的研讨会。那台湾农村经济协会众所周知，它是目前台湾农业经济领域规模最大的学会除了超过400多位以上的个人会员之外，还有40多个知名的团体会员。那每一年呢，除了会举办会员大会跟学术研讨会之外，也会跟各个人民团体、各个学会团体来共同举办国际性的研讨会跟国际性的讨论。每一年呢都会选拔最佳的硕博士论文积极来提升我们的年轻朋友的研究的能力。那我们的台湾经济协会。台湾农村经济协会所发行的农业经济丛刊经过大家还有历任的编辑委员的努力，还有各位会员的积极的投稿，那个其实水准越来越高。那目前已经被收录到 TSSCI 里面，看起来目前大概是在台湾农业经济领域最具影响力的一个期刊。所以我们农村经济协会在过去这么多年经营下来所有的理事长、所有的会员的努力之下，在台湾对台湾社会的不管在社会上、在学术上都有非常好的一个贡献。那其实在基于过去的杰出的研究、杰出的成就底下，那其实将来能够持续发挥这样的影响力那对台湾农业经济还有各个面向的社会都能够有非常大的影响力。那最后再次的欢迎各位莅临我们中兴大学来参加这个非常棒的一个研讨会。那我也预祝今天的研讨会圆满成功各位贵宾身体健康，万事如意。谢谢各位，谢谢。
好，我们下一位邀请来这边的重量级贵宾帮我们开幕致辞的是一直在挹注很多的研究资源，让农经学会里面的年轻学者能够成长，也让我们在整个会务上面能够顺利运作。我们欢迎计划处的庄老大庄处长。
卢理事长，副校长，各位老师，大家早安。早。农村经济协会一直给农委会很多帮忙那为什么会这样子？因为农委会很多政策要上路之前要经过很多评估。那大家过去觉得农业好像是以自然科学为主那的确过去是这样，可是要把它上路成政策的时候，就要很多的评估。除了自然科学以外，社会科学是非常重要的。那像我们最近大家在讲气候变迁跟净零排放，那我们现在也正在评估希望有更多的社会科学的挹注，把我们过去采行的这些措施，要因应气候变迁的时候，到底有采行这些措施跟没有采行这些措施，到底 成本是怎么样，真正的影响是怎么样。另外一个，接下来要做净零排放的时候，我们今天的讨论里面也有跟气候变迁，也有跟循环、跟碳权有关的这些议题哈。那我们希望的是说，我要对焦到净零排放温室气体的时候，我投注的成本到底多少的碳需要花多少成本？那什么样的自然科学的技术才是真正能达到净零的效益？这个在我们社会科学、在农业经济上的研究就非常重要哈。那也希望说，不管是以学会的名义，或是学会会员的个人老师的名义哈，都可以继续给农委会来支持，让我们的政策可以更贴近我们的土地，更贴近农民，当然也要更有效率，要有成本效益的概念哈，这样子整个农业的施政才会更有效率，把政府的经费是用一样的经费可以做更大的事情，更发挥更多的效应哈。那希望不管是 online 的或是 onsite 的这些朋友们或老师专家，以后可以继续给农委会大力的协助。那也预祝今天的年会还有研讨会顺利成功，谢谢大家。
谢谢处长以及谢谢副校长。那我们这边是不是就借各位的双手，让我来做个感谢？那我们是不是有请副校长跟处长到前面，让我们致赠一点小小的心意？谢谢。来，我们在哪边拍照？来，谢谢。我们在这边是不是？
很感谢采用我们。
来，谢谢大家，谢谢二位，谢谢。We had this innovative way to deliver the keynote online, but also we have the room equipped for all the setting, so we can join this keynote. Professor McCarl was so nice that he actually pre-recorded the whole keynote for us, so the whole file is saved here. In any case, the connection is lost, we can swap it and then jump in right away to play the video, so we get to see the whole lecture, the whole keynote. And then we tried to test this connection for a number of different platforms, a number of different times. So it's actually at the night, Friday evening, over there at the College Station. So please let us welcome Professor Bruce McCarl to give us the keynote for the day.
Okay, so I guess that means I start now. I guess I should say good morning, although it's 9 o'clock at night here. And the background you see behind me is a virtual one. It's not where I am at the moment. It's very dark where I am at the moment. But anyhow, I'm going to give a talk about a methodological system that we've developed to do climate change appraisal. And I have a number of people who've worked on it that are surrounding me. I won't try to go through all the names and what they've done, because sometimes my Chinese pronunciations aren't very good anyhow. Cheng Fei, who is waving, is one who's helping me right now. She's my postdoctoral research associate, although soon to become an assistant professor here at Texas A&M. So with that, let me share the screen and bring this up. There it went. Okay, so oops. I want to talk about a climate change analysis system where we do analyses of crop and livestock issues, and we have this overall system to look at these issues. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person, but at the time we were talking about this, you still had a quarantine policy, and besides, my daughter is arriving from Dallas with her family the day after tomorrow, so it would have been difficult to get there and get back. So I'm going to focus on the modeling system, and then later I'm going to show you some examples of how we've used various elements of the system for climate change analysis. This is the basic modeling system that I want to describe. It has three major parts and one sort of exogenous part. The blue there is the physical impact part that gives us estimates of how climate change affects production, cost, variability, resources available, water use, greenhouse gas emissions. And we do that under a particular climate scenario. Then in the center, we have an economic model that gives us aggregate production and production by region, resource usage, consumption, processing, and impacts. Generally, I'm using a US version of this, but there's a Taiwan version of this that I'll discuss briefly. And then on the right-hand side, we do some external environmental impact analysis with some other models. And then finally, we feed in international trade. So let me go down through the components of this. On the physical impact side, we have, like I said, we're looking at production cost, variability, et cetera. We do this for crops, for livestock, for water, which is the hydrology part, for non-ag demands, for greenhouse gas information, pesticide cost, and then country data. And we have downscaled climate scenarios from the IPCC in there. So on the crop side, what we're really trying to do is see how crops grow under climate and management, plus how much water they use and what their environmental interaction is. In general, what this means is we're looking at dryland and irrigated crop yield, irrigated crop water use. We don't only, when we're looking at crops, we include grass under that. So the development of pasture grasses and hays that are available for livestock. We look at erosion, nitrogen and phosphorus runoff, and some greenhouse gas emission and sequestration items. We run this with a given management type and a given crop mix and a climate scenario. So we'll run this multiple times to simulate different management, et cetera. We use a mixture of crop simulation models, which are EPIC and Century, and to some extent SWOT. And then we use a formula called the Blaney-Criddle model, because some of the ways we can do things don't give us estimates of how much the change was in irrigation water use, and the Blaney-Criddle we use for that. And then finally, we have a family of crop yield regressions. We have estimates for 16, it's either 16 or 18 crops in the United States where we have climate-related regressions. We use this to look at climate change effects, greenhouse gas emissions, the effects of alternative tillage and irrigation regimes, residue removal, how much we fertilize, whether or not we use deficit irrigation, and some issues in climate adaptation. And down here, I supply a set of references to that. The last 2 pages of the presentation detail all these references if anybody wants to look some of that material up. On this crop side, we have a general conception that if it's extremely cold, the crop is not going to yield anything. And if it's extremely hot, it's going to not yield anything. Then in between, we have this inverted U-shaped curve. And generally, we think most of the crops will operate up in this range. But what happens in the US and elsewhere is, as it gets warmer, crops that may be down here below their best temperature may progress to be up here above the best temperature. And as a consequence, yields start to fall. We estimate this using a procedure that Chi-Chung Chen and I developed a long time ago, which is what's called a just production function. And we applied that to climate. This term gives us the mean response of yields to climate, and this term out here gives us the variance of the response of the variance of yield response to changes in climate. The X or independent variables in this case are things like growing season degree days, and that may involve growing degree days at various temperature conditions along here. So how many days are in this particular interval? And then sometimes we'll have a hot interval and how many days are over here. And we may have a cold interval, how many days are down in this level, in order to predict the effects of climate extremes on either the hot or cold side on the yield. We also look at drought conditions. We look at carbon dioxide levels, although in order for that to work, we have to have something called the FACE experiments, where carbon dioxide is independently varied, because otherwise the correlation coefficient between carbon dioxide and time is about 0.97. We also use time to proxy technical progress. And then we have some extreme measures that involve drought conditions, or whether there were hurricanes or typhoons or whatever. And then finally, some crop economic conditions and possibly deviation from prior climate. So we want to know if today's climate is about equal to 10 years ago, or if it's 10 degrees warmer or something like that. The larger the difference from the historical climate, the more we expect to see an effect on yield. We have a similar component for livestock. Here we're interested in how livestock grow, produce milk, reproduce, and younger animals die under climate and management. We have animal slaughter weight for fed beef, hogs, and chickens, birth rates for cow-calf hogs, chicken egg laying, young animal survival, milk yields, land use. We're using regressions only for this because there really aren't good livestock simulation models, although we do on occasions use some disease spread models that, for example, tell how avian influenza spreads through the US chicken herd, which it's currently doing. And we have some calculations where we'll calculate certain things. Here, we use this to look at land use, animal feed needs, disease spread, carcass load, resource needs, and climate change mitigation. One of the people on the call here, her PhD thesis was in the fed beef arena. To estimate this, we again have the same production function form, except here the dependent variables, often we're looking at the temperature humidity index, not temperature by itself, because animals perform less well if it's hot and humid than if it's hot and dry. We'll have year-round precipitation and precipitation intensity, drought conditions, time again to proxy technical progress, some extreme measures, some economic stuff, and deviations from prior climate. We get results like this one here. This is the calving survival rate. And as we estimated it in a PhD thesis, and what it shows is here around 80 degrees Fahrenheit is the best calving rate, and if it gets warmer, the calving rate drops off, or if it gets colder, the calving rate drops off. This other one is the death rate for young calves. So the best survival is down here at the bottom, and then it gets worse on either side. For hydrology, what we are interested in is how much water is available in surface and groundwater forms under climate and El Nino and sometimes decadal climate variability. We want to know what happens to the stock in the aquifer. For this, we tend to use the SWAT model, which is a surface water assessment tool. The USGS's ModFlow model, which simulates aquifers and sometimes regressions from water data. We use this, like I said, to look at depletion and water supply. And this is kind of an example of something we used. There's something called the Edwards Aquifer over around San Antonio, Texas. And up until about 1979, the annual recharge to that aquifer was increasing, but since then it's been decreasing. And notice also it's heteroscedastic over here. The variance was quite a bit less on this side than it is in more recent times. On non-agricultural components, I don't really know very much about water competition in Taiwan, but here in the United States, the city of San Antonio is growing rapidly, and it has bought about half the water that was traditionally used in agriculture. So what we want to take a look at is what's the future projection for agricultural water or for non-agricultural water demands, as well possibly as land use and some climate effects on the labor force, because when it gets warmer, the labor force becomes less available and less effective when they work. We do regressions from the climate data or from historical data in order to do some of this, although there's a paper by Tom Hertel that's referenced down here where they look at some of the labor force disruptions. On the greenhouse gas component function, here what we're interested in is to try to take a look at how much is going to be sequestered in soils under different management practices. And then if we're driving a truck down the road to bring bioenergy feedstocks into a processing plant, how much greenhouse gas is emitted in producing the bioenergy feedstock and in hauling it and then in processing it. To do that kind of work, we use a model called GREET, which is developed at Argonne Labs. We also use something called OpenLCA, which has greenhouse gas numbers for a lot of industrial processes. And then we use FASM GHG, which is our agricultural sector model, which Heng-Chi Lee developed in part during her dissertation. Then on the pesticide cost, we quite frequently infer that when it gets warmer and more humid, we're going to have more pests. And as an economist, that means we're probably going to devote more effort to pest control if we have more damages. So we don't have the data to estimate the pest frequency econometrically, but we do have the data to look at how much is expended on pests over time and over space. And we've estimated functions like that using regressions from USDA data. Chi-Chung Chen and I first did it in 2001, but we're doing it again right now, updating that information. Finally, then, those were the more active things we had to develop. But on the more passive side, we maintain a large database that we can do our estimations over and draw some inferences from. And we have data for estimations of how crop mixes change with climate, how crop yields change, livestock performance, pesticide costs, crop budgets, information on international trade, and then information on consumption and prices. This is county level data for for the crops and cow-calf operations, but it's state level data for some of the other things, because in the United States, we won't disclose information about an entity in a geographic region I believe if there's less than 3 or it might be 4 of those entities because it's private information. So in the US, we have very industrial hog and chicken and beef feeding and dairy operations, and they're large, and there may only be 1 or 2 of them in a particular geographic area. So the reporting is only on pretty aggregate geographical areas. Finally, we have the what we call global circulation model. This is from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Estimates of future climate projections under what we call shared socioeconomic pathways. So, for example, I don't know if you all are familiar with things like RCP 8.5, which is a continuation of business as usual emissions. But nowadays we have not only the RCP 8.5 scenario, but associated assumptions about population growth and emission controls and income that go along with that. And we have a family of those different SSPs. I think there's 5 or 6 of them now across different emission trajectories and different socioeconomic conditions. That information is made available when the GCM models run, and sometimes their grids are pretty coarse. Other times they're fairly fine. It depends on the model. At one point, the state of Texas, which is 1,600 kilometers up and down and 1,600 kilometers across, roughly speaking, had a total of 4 grids in it. But nowadays, some of those grid models are down much finer. Nevertheless, if we often have a localized version where the thing is downscaled, because in a mountainous country like Taiwan, you're going to have very different climatic conditions varying over, say, a 50-mile area, depending on the elevation and the mountainous conditions. We'll also have THI, temperature humidity index information, and something on the drought index and precipitation intensity calculations. This data for history comes from an Oregon State PRISM group, from the IPCC, and from a local group which downscales US data. I don't know if they downscale Taiwanese data or what the source would be of that. And then finally, there's a group that generates these drought indices. So that's the physical part of this thing. Now, there's a small international trade component which we use. Generally, we think climate change is global, so we can't just analyze Taiwan or the United States by itself. What we do is we shift the supply and demand curves from the rest of the world that Taiwan faces or the US faces. And we get that from CGE studies or sometimes econometric studies. On the econ model component, there's 2 econ models I'll talk about for a minute. One is the FASM model, which stands for Forest and Agriculture Simulating Optimization Model. It gives land use in 63 US regions, market effects for somewhere around 150 commodities, welfare implications, what the acreage allocation is, how much fertilizer was used, what the mix was between irrigated and dry land, export levels, prices, choices of mitigation strategies. So are we using no-till or conventional till, and information on greenhouse gas counts. The FASM GHG version we used was an outgrowth from Heng-Chi Lee's PhD thesis. She created the first draft, but we've worked on it substantially since then. There's also a similar Taiwan model, but that model is ag only. In the US FASM model, we can run with or without the forestry sector. If we run without the forestry sector, that US model is reduced down to something very close in structure to the Taiwanese model. That model is used to look at the same kinds of economic things: what's grown where, what management systems, how much is processed for biofuels, where did the goods go. It gives us the land use and then also some market characteristics and welfare. Ching Chang. I don't have that name perfect because Cheng Cheng has ruined me. There's too many different variants of the name and I don't have it all memorized. But she and Dr. Chen developed that model back in the early 2000s. And then Clark Kung, who's on this call, and told me, or I always have called him Clark. So right now I'll show you his name when we get a little further back. Clark Kung now maintains that model. The general structure of this model is that it's a consumer and producer surplus maximizing model. It maximizes the integral under a number of demand curves minus the integral under a number of supply curves, subject to a relationship between the amount of commodity demanded and the amount produced, where this QBK variable is going to be how much of a particular crop is produced in a particular place or a particular livestock form in a particular place. This second term looks at the factor supplies like water and labor, and here are the water and labor usages when we're producing. And then there's some fixed land endowments, and here's the land usage for the various commodities. This model maximizes producer and consumer surplus, but we actually don't care about that. The first order conditions of that model lead to a perfectly competitive economic equilibrium. So we're using the model to simulate what that equilibrium would be under climate change conditions. So typically we'll solve it once without climate change and once with, and then observe what happens to production and prices and exports, et cetera. From a scope-wise standpoint, the FASM model has forest land, cropland, and pasture land, plus it has some land only dedicated to grazing. That forest land can be exchanged with cropland, or the cropland exchanged with forest land, and similarly the pasture land can go back and forth. Then we have water resources, labor, some national inputs, other resources, and this grazing, and they're all input into either forest production, crop production, or livestock production. Then in turn, if we take this crop production, it can go straight to the market, it can go to processing, or go to feed mixing. If we take something like soybeans to processing, crush the soybeans and get the soybean meal, that would go into feed mixing or back into the livestock. And the oil might be sold out in the marketplace. And eventually we can meet things like biofuel demand, domestic demand, exports, and imports. So notice that the crop production, when we produce a crop, it could go to markets, it could go to processing, it can go into feed, be fed to the livestock, and ultimately into biofuels. So there's a lot of alternative uses displayed in the model. Across that economic model as a whole, what we have is supply curves for land, water, labor, grazing, national inputs, demand curves for feed, processing, export demand, domestic demand, and household or bioenergy demand. And then we'll have some imports and some processing supply, and we derive the overall equilibrium across all these markets. The final component of this analysis system I want to talk about is the component where we get environmental impacts. Now, what we do in that particular case is the U.S. is divided into 63 regions in our model, but we try to reduce the solution down to 2,200 agricultural counties. So we're doing what they call downscaling, where we take the regional crop mix from FASM and downscale it to a county crop mix based on consistency with some census information we've got. And then we can do water quality simulations and have geographic information systems. So the reason we have this regionalizing model is to do the downscaling. And then this water quality model is typically the surface water assessment tool. And I'll show you an example of it in a moment. The regionalizing model allocates land to all 2,000 counties. It solves a multi-objective mathematical programming model, which minimizes the deviation from land use patterns we've seen in the past. The land use patterns are going to be the maximum amount of cropped area in a county, the minimum amount of cropped area in the county, the maximum irrigated land, the maximum observed area for a particular crop, the minimum observed area for that crop, some consistency with a historical crop mix choice. And then we also included an adjacency constraint that says that if that county typically had 80% of the corn acreage that this county does, we try to maintain that ratio as close as possible to the ratio between adjacent counties. Chi-Chung Chen and I developed this 20 years ago. Now, that's what the analytical system is. So let's just look at a few simple uses of it. Usually when I give a presentation like this, I start here and basically discuss the results of our analysis. Today, I wanted to discuss a little bit more the methodological things we were up to. So I'm going to be very brief when I discuss the analysis results. So here, this is the basic climate change thrusts. There's 3 different thrusts that we can pursue. The first thrust is what is the impact of climate change? Here we want to know how much less productivity or how much more productivity, what's it do to markets, what's it do to welfare, what's it do to land allocations, what's it do to the mix between crops and livestock, or say the mix between rice and wheat or other kinds of grains. That's usually called climate change effects, although it can also be called climate change impacts. On the next part, what we consider is the issue of climate change adaptation. Now, climate change adaptation is the kind of thing that you do on a day when it's raining. You take an umbrella. You use that umbrella to shield yourself from the effects of it raining, but you don't change whether or not it's raining at all. So climate change adaptation is where you reduce the damages caused by climate change, but not the extent of climate change. So that in that circumstance, if it's getting too warm, somebody may switch to another crop or go into grasslands or something like some kind of action like that without changing the how warm it is. When we go to the third issue, which is called climate change mitigation, here we commonly call this greenhouse gas control, where we're limiting the carbon footprint and emissions from the country. In that particular case, we're limiting the future extent of climate change. So there's 2 climate change adaptive actions that agriculture can undertake. One reduces the damages of how much the climate change was, and that's adaptation. The other one reduces the net greenhouse gas output of the agricultural sector. That's on the mitigation side. And we've investigated all those questions. So now I'm going to show you a few examples. So here on the climate change impact side, we have been looking at physical productivity impacts and economic implications. And I could give you a whole seminar on either one of those topics. So I'm just going to be pretty superficial and show you a few results that I find of great concern. So here on the physical productivity side, here's one. This is the relationship between agricultural yield growth and climate change. Now, we're doing some investigations on this. I've had 2 students do dissertations, and I have another one doing a dissertation, plus Cheng Cheng is doing some work on this, where we try to take a look at what's the evolution of crop yield change over time, of crop yields over time. Here, this shows crop yields in the United States for corn, which is our largest crop, from 1950 up to 2020. Notice in 1950, it got about 40 bushels per acre. Today, it's somewhere about 180 bushels per acre. So in that 70-year span, we've had over a 4 times increase in yields. If we run a regression line through this, the best fitting line is this linear one in a time series sense, where every year the corn yield is 1.957 bushels larger than it was last year. Now, our average corn yields today in the country are, somewhere up here in the 180 range. So if we're going up 2 bushels, we're going up roughly 1% per year in our productivity estimates. But that's been maintained for a long time. Cheng Cheng did some decomposition of this, and she ran a regression for this first period, because notice here, the yield growth seems a little larger than this up in this period. And she got that in that period, the yield growth was about 2.57 bushels per year. Then she ran 1975 to 2011. Now, in about 75 when climate change started taking off, and notice the regression coefficient has now dropped down to 1.88. So we saw almost a 25% reduction in the rate of yield growth between this period and that period. And then if we take the last 10 years, that yield growth has dropped to about 1 bushel per year. So we're off 50% or more, depending on which number you use. We think that there's multiple reasons why this is happening, and we're trying to explore that. One thing that a student named Montali did, who's got this is her last name, but I'm not very good at pronouncing it. She works for the Bank of Thailand now, is she looked in all kinds of different regions in the US, and she ran a 2-part regression where she found an optimal break point. And what she found in this case is about 1982 was the best fitting break point, with the regression line being this dotted line up to that point, and then this dotted line from thereafter. And similarly for the Southern Plains, this line up until about 1970, and then this line from 1970. When we did our analysis, we basically found that the growth rates of every crop that we looked at, of about 18 in every place, was diminished in the later time periods. So we're trying to explain why that happens. We think, although I don't have time to go into it here, that it's caused by a change in research and development investment and it's caused by climate change forces. The research and development investment is because more money is being spent nowadays on marketing and environmental issues as opposed to pure productivity issues. So we're spending a little less money in the United States, and we're diluting that money away from productivity issues. So that's the physical impact stuff that I wanted to cover. Now I want to talk about an economic piece that we did. This is a paper that we did a report for the Environmental Protection Agency, and we're about to get it published, we think. So the research question here is what are the effects, what are the impacts of climate change? And to do that analysis, we simulated crop yields into the future using a crop simulation model and using some of our regressions. On the livestock side, we used the livestock productivity estimates that came from a number of my students, including Ivania, who's here on the call. This is Minglu Wang and Chin Fang and Muxi Cheng. Muxi Cheng. Muxi is currently working on this stuff. The others are finished and out. Now, what we did in this study is we looked at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 degree displacements across 6 different GCMs. So what we did is we looked at a particular GCM and we looked at the data for climate and rainfall on that when it hit 1 degree or when it hit 2 or 3, 4 or 5 or 6. Here for corn, notice when we do that in the crop simulation model, this LPJML, it shows the corn yields are only marginally affected. Our regression model shows they're substantially affected. This shows at 6 degrees about a 5% reduction. Here we're showing about a 30% reduction. We have the same kind of result here for soybeans, where that model is more optimistic. And for wheat, we find our regression models more optimistic. And for this spring wheat, we'll find that the crop simulation model is more optimistic. These 3 crops are C3 crops, which get some yield stimulation from carbon dioxide. Corn doesn't get very much of that. So it's not, it doesn't show the yield increase that we see in some of these other crops. Rice and cotton, by the way, are greatly stimulated by carbon dioxide. In another analysis, we found that about 40% of the yield growth in rice that we've observed around the world is coming from carbon dioxide effects. So we also looked at what climate change did to hogs and broilers. Here for hogs, we find as much as a 3% or so decline in hog slaughter weight. For broilers, this looks more dramatic, but the scale is different. This is more around 0.7% reduction due to climate change effects. Then we ran that through an economic model, and our results show climate change is beneficial for U.S. agriculture. That's principally because areas in the north are limited by cold, areas in the south are limited by heat, and we're able to move our crop production further north in order to accommodate the warmer conditions, and it starts to remove some of the cold limitations in the northern areas. Okay, so that was climate change effects. Now a little bit on climate change adaptation. The first, we did 2 things here. What have we observed has happened? And then what do we project is happening? Now we started taking a look very recently, about a month ago, at how the incidence of crops was changing across the country. This picture here is for corn. This is where the percentage share of the area cropped in each county during 1975. And here's the percentage share cropped to corn in each county in 2015. And notice here, up in this area, up in the Dakotas and Minnesota, here's South Dakota, North Dakota, and Minnesota, there's hardly any corn up in those areas. But when we get out here to 2015, all of a sudden now we're seeing substantial corn in this area. The darker colors mean a higher density. You can see that there's been a very significant shift here, that the crop has moved north and west. Now, when it moves north, it gets cooler. In the United States, when it moves west, it's moving toward the Rocky Mountains, which are out here, meaning it's going up in elevation. So the crop is moving into cooler areas. And notice here, it was heavily grown along the East Coast and in Florida and in Georgia and places like that. And notice by this time, it's not grown there anymore. We wanted to take a look at what was taking its place. And this is alfalfa, non-alfalfa hay. So this is, I don't know how many of you are familiar with it, but it's hay fields where they cut the hay and put it in large round bales, and it's over on the side. Notice there was hardly any of that hay. This gray color means that there wasn't enough for them to report, but notice by 2015 there's a lot. So as the corn has moved out, the hay's come in and taken its place. We also had I had a couple of Korean graduate students do estimates of what happened as the temperature increased to land use in crops. And notice in the coldest conditions, it's using wheat. This one is the spring wheat. And then as the condition gets warmer, we see corn and soybeans coming in. And as it gets warmer than that, we see cotton and sorghum coming in. And then when it gets real hot, it only dominantly uses rice. Now, there is one problem in this analysis we're now trying to fix, which is this was run with what's called a multinomial logit, meaning the sum of the probabilities to those crops had to equal 1, and we didn't have hay in the study. So notice wheat is 100% on this end, and it's 100% on that end. Rice is 100% on this end. But if we look at the difference between cropland and pasture land, as that temperature gets hotter and hotter, the cropland decreases and the pasture land increases. And also, this is the stocking rate on grasslands. As it gets warmer, that stocking rate goes down, meaning less animals per unit of land. So this is showing how U.S. farmers are adapting to climate change. And we did the same sort of thing. I'm beginning to run out of time, so I'll go a little faster. We did the same sort of thing in a modeling study. This is out of Witsanu Adavanich's PhD thesis. And what it shows, the darker green is where a region in the United States had excess corn, so more corn produced than demanded. The red areas, so there was more corn demanded than was produced. Well, notice here, these maps here are under different climate change scenarios. This is a no climate change case. Notice up here, this area has become a lot darker under these. That's again showing this northward and westward shift. The previous stuff was coming out of observed data in the database. This is coming out of running the model under different climate change scenarios. And to some extent, it helps verify the model because it shows the model wants to do what we're observing in the world. Finally, in that study, the Mississippi River in the United States it comes out here in Louisiana, it goes up here on the western edge of Illinois and up into this area. Well, with these climate change shifts, what's happening is we're reducing the amount of grain that would come down the river to Louisiana, to New Orleans and Baton Rouge, and we're shipping more out to Pacific Northwest ports, Great Lakes, and Atlantic ports. What's happening is that grain is getting further from the river, so it's cheaper to put it on a train and send it out than it is to haul it to the river and then send it down in the barges. This shows climate change is having effects on the location of agricultural infrastructure. Okay, the final thing I want to do is talk about climate change mitigation. This is out of a PhD thesis by a former student of mine named Uwe Schneider. When we did that study, we were working with some agronomists who told us that every acre in the United States could sequester 1 ton of carbon. And so that's this figure out here. But when we said, okay, how much will you get when you pay different amounts? We could only get about 2/3 of the way to that estimate. And when we said, but suppose carbon sequestration is not the only game in town, you also could produce biofuels or put trees on the land or do other kinds of actions. In that particular case, the carbon sequestration from a conversion to no-till initially was one of the cheaper things we could do and happened. But then when it hit a particular price, it became cheaper to substitute other things in. So under a competitive condition, we didn't keep increasing that. We actually started decreasing it and using the land for other usages. And this to me indicates when you're considering different actions in Taiwan for how to reduce greenhouse gases from agriculture, that it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all solution. It's going to be a portfolio of solutions. Plus, don't trust the engineers or the agronomists who assume every acre in the whole country can go over, because there's certainly going to be an economic signal where only part of it's going to go over. Finally, we did run the FASM model with forestry and dynamically in Heng-Chi Lee's thesis. And here at a low carbon price, we see the amount of emissions split between growing or taking better care of forests, doing some things with agricultural soils, and some non-CO2 like livestock and rice methane management. The sequestration ones rose up for a while, but then they tended to stabilize. And we see that behavior here. But at a high carbon price, we got a big increment from bioenergy. This was mainly electricity, using agricultural commodities to fuel electricity, like Clark Kung has been working on in Taiwan. And that shows that that is the dominant force over in sort of overwhelms the sequestration things. So at low carbon prices and in the near term, we do some things with ag soils and forestry and non-CO2. When we get to higher carbon prices and in the longer term, it's mainly bioenergy and non-CO2 management. And one last final thing on here on climate change mitigation is we try to take a look when we put in this changes in the forest and biofuel inventory, what effects that had on water quality. And we ran our models and got a result like this that showed as we had higher and higher greenhouse gas prices, we cleaned up the water down here in the eastern Great Plains. And then we also cleaned it up in the Mississippi River Basin and out here along the coast. So by downscaling our solutions to the hydrological unit 8 level, and then running this crop simulator, we could find a positive water quality effect. So conclusions, we've developed this complicated analytical system. My first student that did his work on it finished his PhD in 1978 and recently retired. And today I have other students doing it. There have been a host of the former students from Taiwan and other areas there in Asia. Here's a list of names, although Man-Kun Kim, I think, is just visiting. I don't think he's resident in the country. And a couple of them are employed on the mainland as opposed to being employed in Taiwan. There is a version of the model that I was using to get the economic results for Taiwan that Clark Kung here is maintaining. We've used this modeling system to get what I think are important insights on impacts of climate change, mitigation, and adaptation. I think the Taiwanese version so far has largely been employed for climate and bioenergy analysis, although other people in the room or on the call are far more qualified to speak about what that has been used for. Much more is possible with this, and right now I have 11 PhD students and 1 master student doing various components of it, so we continue developing it. So with that, here are the references. I went 50 minutes, so now I am open for questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor McCarl. This is a very nice, well-organized keynote. You give us a concentration of like 3 decades of research in this theme, in this area. So right now, let's take questions from the audience. Any questions here? In English or in Chinese? Yes, please.
我想请教一下，就是教授，就是有关他提到的这个模式，好像提到的是比较是国家模式或区域式的，就是整个架构的分析。那我想问一下，就是以农企业来讲，怎么把这个气候变迁的因素呢，能够在这个我们以农企业的这个 cost 或者它的一些报表上面去呈现这种区域上的付出，这个 cost 成分怎么去呈现
Okay, thanks for the question. I will try to translate it. Professor McCall, you have presented all these the findings in the research based on a countrywide study. If it's for agribusiness firms, how could we incorporate the climate change in the cost and also have the cost development in the framework and then to put it as an external factor in future planning?
Well, one of my other Taiwanese students, Yan-Ho Lee, we called him Stanley Lee, did his PhD thesis on a bioenergy facility. And so what he was trying to take a look at in the context of that thesis is under different circumstances, what crops would you grow? Where would you grow them? How would you move them to the facility? How would you design the facility? And we did some analysis where we would take prices from a model like the national model and then feed them into this regional model and go ahead and run that regional model. We're also doing that in the high plains of Texas, where we have an aquifer that has water in it that was 1 million years old, and we're depleting that. And we're trying to take a look at how bioenergy policy might accelerate the depletion of that. So we take the prices from the national model and then fill them in to do the regional model. Now, if you were talking about, say, a seed company and what they might, or let's talk about a hog feeding company, you could use something like our regressions for what happens to commodity production and what happens to the hog birth rate and the young hog survival rate, and then go through an analysis in that particular case of what implications this had for the way that firm might structure itself. Also, in some cases, we can look at adaptation strategies. So, for example, in our livestock feeding operations, in some cases, they have sprinklers that sprinkle water on the animals to cool them. Also, Wolfgang, who I think was here a while ago, I don't know if he's still here, in his thesis, he took a look at different animal breeds in different places. And in the United States, in the hotter areas, we're seeing Indian cattle breeds that are white as opposed to black and smaller frame, so they perform a little bit better under temperature. So the basic thing is we could use some of the physical econometric stuff to estimate yield relationships, and then some of the runs of the sector model to see what happened to prices to get some future implications.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor McCarl. Any other questions? That's a very nice, very good question. Other questions? Any questions from the audience on site, online?
首先啊，我这个非常敬佩这个Professor McCarl 这个这么丰富的这个研究，还有这么精彩的演讲啊，这个演讲真的是非常的完美哈。那我现在请教一个问题，就是说像这么好的一个模型，然后导出的很多这个巨细靡遗的这个有参考价值的资料，那请问贵国的政府就说怎么样去参考？就说他曾经参考你们哪一个资料，然后有订定了哪一个法律，或者是说推出了哪一个政策？谢谢。
Thank you. I'll translate this question. Professor McCarl, you have delivered a very nice presentation. It's a perfect one. And then in all the models you had developed, is there any findings from your analytical part being implemented in policy or by the stakeholders to develop further political analysis, policy analysis, or other areas that can apply the findings in your research and then can extend this into implementation?
Well, we developed a version of this model to study bioenergy issues, and the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency was using that version to set rules for when you converted particular feedstocks into ethanol or biodiesel, what was the greenhouse gas offset? They had a policy the U.S. government passed that supported production of different feedstocks, or supported blending of gasoline at different levels depending on the greenhouse gas offset of the ethanol. So they called it advanced biofuels if it offsets 60% or more of the emissions from combustion. They called it, I can't remember, but kind of conventional biofuels if it was 30% or less. And the model was being used to estimate the greenhouse gas footprint of the different greenhouse gas, of the different ethanol blending forms. We also, at one point, ran this model to study what would happen with coastal erosion regulations. And the USDA had proposed one form of the regulations. We went through and did some simulations and showed another form was much less economically damaging but control the same amount of externalities. We did do a bunch of runs to try to identify what the best climate change mitigation strategy was, but we did that just before Trump got elected, and that particular information is just, we're restarting to develop that again now several years later. Right at the moment, I'm concerned with how the US spends its $18 billion that it's supposed to get us on the path toward net zero emissions. And we're starting to generate some results on that. The final thing I'll say is USDA has a version of this model that they use in their environmental policy analysis.
Thank you. Any other questions? Well, I have one question for Professor McCarl. You have analyzed all the data based on the historical data that you realize the impact on the environment. And then what is the future? Can we predict what will be in the future scenario based on the data we have on hand, or is it more of the policy side or the other factors that is not in our control?
Well, there's different kinds of ways you can analyze the future. If you develop a family of econometric models and you project what's going to go on in the future, you could develop models. There's a guy named Rob Mendelson who runs these models. He calls Ricardian models to look at how land rents change. But in the case where he's running, he can't really factor carbon dioxide into the analysis. Historically, the carbon dioxide hasn't changed all that much, and the carbon dioxide's been highly correlated with time. It goes up by about an even number of points every year. So you can't separate carbon dioxide effects from technological change effects very easily. So in that particular case, you need something like these crop simulation models or something like the regression models we use, where we try to factor CO2 in based on some agronomic experiments. So we use this model to project in the future regularly. The reason we use this optimization model as opposed to an econometric model is we don't think the future is going to be like the past, and therefore we take a lot more assumptions on about perfect competition and put in crop budgets and get different physical effects that you wouldn't necessarily need if you were talking about changing the rice support price by 10 cents or whatever that might be. So we use this modeling system to project things that we really haven't seen before on the Earth, substantial temperature increases in regions that haven't had those kinds of things. If I'm looking at short-term effects on bioenergy policy, I may have seen enough in the past that I can use econometrics. So it's always a methodological choice question when you're projecting into the future.
All right, thank you very much. And I know the time is running over a little bit, but we do appreciate your effort and your assistant and then Professor Chen Fei and all this preparation and organization that we had. I think we delivered a pretty nice presentation. Do you agree? Please, let's thank Professor McCarl. Thank you very much, and then we will hope to see you in May next year. Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.